Brazil. Thanks, Emily, and thanks everyone for coming today. It's really weird looking at the audience because everyone's sitting on the side, so apologies if I'm just looking that way. Like Emily said, I'm going to be talking about two projects today. One was the basis of my postdoc here at the center, and the other one's a project that I recently started in Brazil in collaboration with Projeto Tamar, which is a conservation group on marine turtles in Brazil. So obviously for both projects there was lots of collaborators, and I just want to acknowledge them. Most of them are here. There's others that are not there because the list is very big. So for both of these projects, I'm focusing on a common dilemma. That is, how to prioritize limited resources in the most effective way. I don't know about you guys, but every fortnight I face a dilemma. How to best prioritize my salary so that I can obtain the most benefits. Obviously, when I'm allocating the money that I have to think about what are my life goals and what things I want to achieve with the money I have. Natural resource managers face a similar problem. They have limited resources, and they have to decide how to best allocate these resources to obtain the most conservation outcomes. So just to put into context, there's several thousands of species, and a lot of them have cultural, social, economic, and ecological value to communities and to people. And a lot of those species, they face several threats, and there's a lot of different management strategies that can be used to mitigate those threats. However, more and more resources are limited, so managers need to prioritize where they put the money in order to accomplish their conservation objectives. To help managers do this, there's a series of different frameworks and decision support process that exist currently to help them allocate their resources. And most of these prioritization frameworks, they help prioritize species to manage based on species level endangerment, evolutionary distinctiveness, socio-political significance, and the potential for recovery of that species. So obviously managers don't really want to put their money where the chances of being successful is low. And obviously also prioritization happens related to the cost of actions and the cost of conserving and managing different species. So these frameworks, they have been really good at identifying or shortlisting one species or a set of species for prioritization. However, after we have identified one species or a few species, there's a lack of decision frameworks to help select how to allocate resources within the different life stages of those species or the different populations for this species. And this is particularly an issue for species that have different life stages and that they experience different threats at each of the different life stages. So for the different life stages, managers have to select or have to prioritize which ones they're going to focus and which management strategies they're going to use. So if we use sea turtles as an example here, sea turtles have different life stages, and for the different life stages, they use different habitats. All of these life stages and habitats are experiencing a multitude of different impacts. So managers need to decide which of those impacts they're going to focus on and which management strategies they're going to use to tackle those different impacts. So, for example, for sea turtles, a lot of the actions that exist to mitigate those threats are related on the recovery plan. However, in the recovery plans, often there's some guidance on which actions to use, but there's no transparency indicating which actions should be used or not. So obviously there is a need for a transparent framework that helps managers prioritize which actions to use to mitigate threats. So to help tackle this, I developed a framework that explicitly prioritizes actions to minimize the impacts of several threats across the species range. And in this case, I used marine turtles as a case study. So this framework uses a budget constraint and maximizes the expected improvement in species persistence resulting from a set of management actions. And the reason why I decided to focus this prioritization exercise this way, having a constrained budget, is mainly to reflect management context. So another way that I could achieve this problem is by saying, okay, this is my management objectives, how much money do I need to achieve this? But unfortunately, this is very unrealistic nowadays, so we have to work with constrained budgets. Another thing that this framework accounted for is the likelihood of the actions being successfully applied and accepted by local communities. And this is very important because obviously you don't want to prioritize or select an action that is not going to be well accepted by communities. So to test this framework, I used the Eastern Gulf of Carpentaria and Torres Strait flatback population. And if you can see from this map, this population nests in the Northern Territory and also in the Western Gulf of Carpentaria. And the management of these nesting grounds are done in collaboration between government agencies, local national resource management groups, and indigenous communities. So just for the non-turtle nerds in the audience, flatback turtles are endemic to Australia, and this means that they only nest in Australia, and they feed in waters of the Australian continental shelf all the way to the Gulf of Papua. So I don't know if you can see here is the waters that they use. This species is very important because they lack an oceanic phase and they remain in the surface waters of the continental shelf. So in Australia, there's 4 populations of flatbacks that encompass 7 major nesting aggregations. And this, I don't know if you can see here, but this one is the one that this study focused on. So the data that I used for this framework and the way I approached the framework was to reflect the management decisions that are currently happening in the Cape in relation to the Cape York Turtle Conservation Program. So this program has been in operation since 2006, and currently it's administered by the Cape York Natural Resource Management Group. But just to highlight the importance of this study and the need for this study, since I started this project 3 years ago, the administration of the resources in this group has changed several times in Cape York, and also the way that the money is distributed towards the groups for turtle conservation has changed several times, which made it very difficult to collect the data and to set on a particular framework. So the program works with partner Indigenous communities across Western Cape York to develop local conservation initiatives for marine turtles in the region. So basically Cape York Natural Resource Management, they receive a bucket of money and they have to allocate that money across the different communities in Western Cape. So to reflect the management context of this case study, we're looking at prioritizing resources to mitigate threats to nesting grounds or eggs in Western Cape York. So through the initial work that I did, I identified 11 management units, which are the 11 nesting grounds, 2 main impacts to those nesting grounds, which is harvest and predation, and 31 potential management actions that can be used to mitigate those threats. Before I go on, I just want to highlight that even though I use this framework to prioritize resources for eggs, this framework can easily be adapted to multiple life stages and also to other contexts. So the first thing that I did was define the spatial extent of the study area, and this might seem pretty simple. However, it's very important to pay attention to this, because if you are not properly defining the context of the management or the spatial extent of the study area, it means that your results might not be applicable on the ground. So it's very important to take some time to actually understand the context of the management that is occurring in the region. So through this process, I identified 11 areas that I was focusing on the prioritization of resources. And the next step was to determine the relative importance of each of those areas. And in this case study, the relative importance of each of the conservation units was related to the number of eggs incubating at those areas. And to obtain that, I simply multiplied the number of turtles nesting by the number of eggs that they nest a season, which is 150. I just want to highlight that if we were to be prioritizing the resources across multiple life stages for sea turtles, for example, we would have to account for the reproductive value of each of those life stages. So, for example, one egg of a sea turtle has lower reproductive value than one nesting sea turtle. So you'd have to account for that if you were prioritizing resources across multiple life stages. So after I determined the relative importance of each of the nesting grounds, the next step was to identify the impacts that they were experiencing and also to identify the magnitude of those impacts. And one of the things that I'm sure a lot of you here know, but Cape York's really remote, so it's been really hard to quantify those threats. So this was when I started this project, and still there's a lack of information for all the nesting grounds in terms of the turtles that are nesting there, and also in terms of the impacts. So the data that went into this framework comes both from limited literature and some of the limited studies that are occurring in the region, and also from expert elicitation. So my expert panel, they consisted of managers, scientists, and people that were doing research on the ground and management on the ground in this region. So basically, I asked my participants to provide a best estimate of the number of turtles nesting in this region, and also the impacts that they're experiencing, and also an upper and lower bound of their estimates, so that I could account for uncertainties on my analysis. So all the information that went into this model are based on opinions and experience from people that are doing the work on the ground. So obviously, as we progress with time and more research is done in the region, we can put this information into the framework to see the different changes. So as I mentioned before, there's two main threats to the eggs in this region: egg harvest and predation. So predation is both by pigs, iguanas, and dogs. So here is just an indication of what my expert panel indicated to be the number of eggs and the impacts that they're experiencing at each area. So here on the x-axis we have the different conservation units, and the bars represent the number of eggs. The black area represents eggs that are not impacted. The dark gray represent eggs that are predated, and the light gray represents eggs that are harvested. So there's a few important things that you can just see just by looking at this graph. One is that one of the areas has a lot of eggs compared to the other. So Crab Island has almost, the same amount of number of eggs incubating as all the other management units, and a lot of the eggs in these regions are not impacted. And this is mainly because it's a remote place and it's hard for humans and pigs to get there. Another thing that you can see is that harvest is not a big issue in the region, and that predation is occurring at mainland sites. So after I identified the threats to those areas, the next step was to identify different management strategies. And here I considered the fact that the effectiveness of management strategy and the opportunity of implementing management strategies changes depending on when they're implemented and if they're implemented in conjunction with other strategies. So, for example, if we were to conduct aerial baiting, which is a common strategy for reducing the number of pigs, that probably would have low acceptability by local communities because they don't really accept that strategy. But if that was coupled with environmental education, it would have a higher acceptability. And it's the same with the effectiveness of some strategies. Some strategies work better if they're conducted at the same time as other strategies. So we tried to account for this by considering strategies both alone and both in cooperation with other strategies, as you can see here in the list. So you can see that some of the strategies that were identified relate to have two strategies. So in some areas we do education and aerial baiting. So in total, we identified 31 management strategies, and these were identified with the expert panel. And those strategies, they related to three different groups. So one was spatial management or active actions. The other one was campaign and education, and the other type of strategy was policy implementation. So obviously, these are a lot of actions, and we cannot undertake all of those actions at all the nesting grounds. Not only they're not, most of those strategies are not feasible, and some of them are not acceptable by communities. So the next step that I undertook was to do a screening with those management strategies to identify implementable strategy for each area. And to do this, I considered the effectiveness of each of those strategies, and effectiveness related to the potential of a strategy mitigating a threat. And that was measured by the proportion of eggs that were saved by using that strategy. And for the purpose of this study, I assumed that that effectiveness of strategy did not vary across the different nesting grounds. The next thing that I looked up was logistical feasibility. So this related to the likelihood of the action being carried out. And it depended on the resources existent, the technology, and the remoteness of the different places. So logistical feasibility varied across the different conservation units. The next thing that I looked at was opportunity of implementing the different actions, and this related to the political and local will to implement the actions at each of the conservation units. And again, the opportunity of implementing actions varied across the different conservation units. So after I screened all of those actions that were suggested by the expert panel, I eliminated some actions that did not meet certain thresholds of effectiveness, logistical feasibility, and opportunity of implementation. And this gave me a set of implementable actions. And just to exemplify here, I have actions in the bars, represented by the bars, and then the different conservation units. You can see that both of these places have less strategies that were suggested, and this is basically reflecting the fact that there's no predation in those areas. But basically there's 31 actions that were suggested, and the dark colors represent actions that were implementable in those areas. But the part of the bars with the symbols represent actions that were eliminated, either because they were not effective, or because they had low opportunity of being implemented, or low feasibility. So for example, if we take Back Beach in Mapoon here, you can see that a lot of the strategies were eliminated because they had low opportunity or low acceptance by communities. And this is mainly because this area is a camping area for local people, so they don't want a lot of strategies being conducted in this region. So you can see that we're able to reduce the number of strategies that are actually implementable in this area. So after I identified the strategies, the next step was to identify the best set of actions that I could use with a limited amount of money to maximize conservation of eggs. And to do this, obviously, I had to look at the cost of the strategies. And for costs, I only considered direct cost of implementing actions. So, for example, when I was looking at reducing harvest of turtle eggs, I did not consider the economic and cultural costs to community. So that's a drawback of the study that should be considered in the future. So there's different categories of costs that were used to calculate costs for each of the management strategies. And here's just to exemplify some of the things that I considered for different management strategies. And another thing that I want to highlight is that the cost was dynamic in space and time. So obviously the cost of a strategy varied for the different conservation units depending on the size of the conservation unit and also the distance that it had from the operating office. So after I calculated the cost for the strategies, and I forgot to say the cost was based on things that have been occurring or being conducted by the different groups on the ground. So it was based on the last cost for the last 2 years. I also looked at the number of eggs that were saved for each of the different management strategies. And the number of eggs that were saved, or the benefit of implementing a strategy at a certain conservation unit, varied depending on the number of eggs at each management unit, the number of eggs that were impacted, and also the effectiveness of the strategy that we're considering. So all these factors influence the number of eggs that would be saved if we implemented an action. And here's just to exemplify. So the bars represent the different colors represent the different conservation units. On the bottom we have the different strategies, and the bars represent the number of eggs that were saved. So here's just to illustrate that even though you might implement one action, the same action in different places, the number of eggs you're saving is different because it's based on the number of eggs that are there and the number of eggs that are impacted. So after I looked at the cost and the benefit of each action, I wanted to optimize the best set of actions for different scenarios of budget and management focus. So I looked at optimization of strategies for different scenarios, and the scenarios that I looked at had different budgets, and the budgets were determined to reflect some of the money that are available for conservation in the Cape. And also I had different scenarios that focus on different management focus. So first I looked at what would happen if we only focused on harvest, what would happen if we only focused in mitigating predation, and what would happen if we looked at both. I also had two sets of scenarios, one that was optimized, and the optimized scenario considered all implementable actions. to explore how to best allocate resources. So basically, the optimized scenario is the scenarios that I put values of budget into the optimization framework and ask them to decide what's the best combination of actions. I also had the pre-selected scenarios, and the pre-selected scenarios were used to explore what are the costs and benefits of things that are suggested by stakeholders. So the pre-selected scenario actually went to the program and said, I wanted to do these actions at these nesting grounds. So it was basically used to compare with the optimized scenarios. So, like I said, I used the decision support software to optimize allocation of resources, and I used a new program called RoBOF. And RoBOF helps find solutions to a significant set of conservation resource allocation problems. So just for those of you that are not familiar with RoBOF, I have an illustration here of the interface of RoBOF, and there's just a few things that I wanted to point out. So basically, you can put the number of environments or conservation units that you're looking at. Here I had 11. You can put the numbers of features, so I only had 1 because I was using eggs. You can also indicate the budget that you're looking at. You have space to put the number of features that you have in each environment, so the number of eggs that I had at each conservation unit. Here you have space to put the cost of the different actions at each of the conservation unit, as well as you have a place to put the number of eggs that are saved at for each strategy at each of the conservation units. And here's where you can have lower and upper bounds to account for the uncertainties in the data that you collected. So all this information is put together, and the program spits out different suggestions of management strategies depending on the budget that you have. So here's just some examples of some of the suggestions that the model provided and actions to use at each of the conservation unit. Obviously, the less money that you have means that some places there will be no strategies that will be implemented in that region. So other things that you can explore with the program is comparing the performance of different scenarios. And for this case study, for example, it showed that the scenarios that had better performance were the ones that were targeting minimizing or reducing the number of pigs, as well as conserving or protecting the nests. And when we compare those scenarios with the ones that only targeted mitigating harvest of eggs, you can see that they had a lot higher performance. You can also look at the cost effectiveness of the different scenarios, and for this case study, I found that the most cost effective scenarios were the ones that were targeting both predation and harvest of eggs. So obviously, all of these results, they're not supposed to be set in stone solutions. They're meant to be starting points for discussions and to systematically analyze the trade-off between different scenarios. In the context of sea turtles, we need to consider multiple life stages as well. I didn't do this in this case study because I wanted to reflect the management context of the region, but obviously if you're looking at a broader project, you have to consider the different life stages and the results might be different. And this framework can easily do this. And another thing that I think it's important is to start considering the trade-offs and how to prioritize resources when you consider current threats and future threats as well. So in order to adapt this decision model for climate change, there's a few things that we need to know. First, we need to know the impacts that different climatic processes will cause to our future. We also have to have an understanding of what are the management strategies that can be undertaken to mitigate the different threats from climate change and how efficient they are at counteracting those impacts. And also we have to have an understanding of the relative benefits of addressing current versus future threats. So to elucidate some of these issues, I started a project in Brazil recently And the goal of this project was to determine how to best prioritize the management of hawksbill and loggerhead turtles in Brazil as temperature increases. So just to put in context, hawksbills in Brazil nest in 2 areas, up here and here, and they nest over 300 kilometers. And loggerhead turtles nest in 4 different areas indicated in the map, and they nest over 700 kilometers of each. So the idea is to help, the agencies in Brazil prioritize their resources, thinking about the future and how increasing temperature might affect sea turtles. So in order for you guys to understand the context of this project, you also have to understand that sea turtles have temperature-dependent sex determination, and this means that the sex of the hatchlings is determined by descent temperature, with warmer temperatures producing more female and cooler temperature producing more males. This means that with predicted increase in temperature, there will be likely a feminization of turtle populations and also a decrease in hatchling success. So there's a need to understand the impacts that increasing temperature will cause to the reproductive output of those 2 species and how these impacts will vary spatially. And this will help us determine the areas that will be the most and least threatened, and also to identify areas that have high conservation value, in this case areas that have higher production of male hatchlings. So in order to assess the impacts of increasing temperature for these 2 species, I'm undertaking an integrated approach where I'm looking at the historical sex ratio produced at those areas, the nesting areas for those 2 species. And for this, I'm using data from Projeto Tamar on incubation duration. And the reason I can use incubation duration is because incubation duration is related to the temperature. I'm also looking at what's currently happening, and for this, I'm looking at the thermal profile of the different nesting grounds used by those 2 species. And both of this information will provide me with a baseline in advance of global warming and will help me elucidate some implications from future extreme female sex biases. So this information on what's happened in the past and what's happening now help me predict what will happen in the future and what the implications are. Just to show a snapshot of some of the data that we have, this is some of the data on proportion of female turtles produced by different nesting grounds in one region in Brazil. And one of the things that I want to highlight here is that we can see both interannual and interbeach variation in the proportion of sex ratios being produced. So it just highlights the need to understand what happened in the future, to understand the variability that might happen in what happened in the past, to understand what happens in the future. And for the last 2 months, I spent traveling throughout the coast, putting temperature data loggers to look at the thermal profile of the different nesting beaches, and this will be used to see what's happening right now in terms of sex ratio. So all this information will be used to understand what might happen in the future. One of the other things that we are interested in understanding is the effectiveness of different strategies and mitigating potential impacts of increasing temperature. So together with stakeholders in Brazil, we started to identify different management strategies that can help mitigate some of the impacts from increasing temperature. And here is just a list of some that were identified, and they go from shading incubating nests to conducting tree planting programs or revegetation programs to cool down the beaches. Another thing that we're interested in is to determine how effective these strategies are. So we started some preliminary work looking at the potential effectiveness of 2 strategies, sprinkling and shading, at reducing sand temperature. And what we found is that not all strategies and all regimes of sprinkling or shading will actually reduce sand temperature. And obviously this is just some preliminary work, and this just highlights that this sort of work needs to be done at a location-specific area, because this will vary depending where you are. For example, in Brazil, they use a lot of hatcheries, and they do use sprinkling, and they have found that sprinkling actually is really good at reducing sand temperature. It just depends on when you undertake the sprinkling that the results will be different. So the next thing that we're trying to understand and get a better grasp of is the relative benefit of focusing on current versus future threats. And to do this, we're going to quantify or try to compare the long-term impacts that current and future threats will have to population sustainability. And I also hope to engage more with the managers in Brazil to try to understand what are some of the opportunities and challenges for managing turtles, especially in relation to things that might happen in the future. So just to finalize, I just wanted to touch on a few points that I think are important that came up from both of these projects. By no means it's an exhaustive list, but it's just 3 things that I thought was worth mentioning when we're conducting prioritization exercises. So the first thing that came up is that the need to have very clear conservation objectives. And one of the things that I noticed is that a lot of the places didn't have that. And obviously, if you're prioritizing resources, you need to know what your objective is, because prioritization will be different depending on what objective you have. So if your objective is to protect 100% of the eggs versus protecting 70% of the eggs, your prioritization will be different. So it's very important to keep in mind and to have it clear what your objective is. The other thing that came out is that there's a lack of strategic approach to quantify and monitor how effective strategies are, and obviously you cannot prioritize if you don't know how good or effective your strategy is. So just want to highlight the need to start to incorporate measurements of effectiveness into any program for conservation. And the last thing is obviously incorporating the social context of that management unit that you're undertaking the prioritization exercise. You don't want to prioritize an action that will have low acceptability and therefore have low implementation and compliance success. So those are the 3 things that came out from both the projects that I thought would be important highlighting. So I hope you enjoyed, and that's all I have for today.